28-year-old Evan Mercer walked into court like he was untouchable. He laughed. He whispered jokes to his lawyer. He rolled his eyes when prosecutors mentioned his mother's name. Diane Mercer had been 64, chronically ill, and struggling to breathe through an oxygen tube when her own son ended her life in the middle of the night. He staged it to look natural. He rehearsed his 911 call. He even cried on cue for the detectives. For months, he believed he had committed the perfect crime. Then the prosecutor dimmed the courtroom lights and pressed play on a hallway camera video Evan thought he had erased. What happened next erased his smile forever. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. This is how it all began. Diane Mercer was not a headline first. She was a widow with a slow gait, an oxygen tube coiled around her living room chair, and the stubborn habit of still taking care of people who no longer deserved it. She had survived loss, illness, and years of quiet sacrifice. But she could not survive the person she trusted most. Her son, Evan, had returned home after another failed job and another broken relationship, and what was supposed to be temporary became permanent. He contributed nothing. He took everything. And when Diane finally decided to change the arrangement, he made sure she would never get the chance. The crime happened in the middle of the night in a quiet Ohio suburb where neighbors still waved and doors were rarely locked. It looked at first like a sad but predictable ending for a sick woman living on borrowed time. But technology does not forget. A small hallway camera kept recording long after Evan thought he had erased the truth. And now, months later, that same footage was about to play in front of a jury, while the man who killed his mother sat just a few feet away, still convinced he was smarter than the evidence. The courtroom felt heavier than usual that morning. Families filled the gallery behind the prosecution table, their faces carved with grief that had settled into something harder over the months since Diane Mercer died. They wore dark clothes and carried photographs they hoped would remind the jury that the woman at the center of this trial had been real, had been loved, and had deserved so much better than the ending she received. Across the aisle sat Evan Mercer, 28 years old, leaning back in his chair with the kind of casual posture that suggested boredom rather than fear. He whispered something to his attorney and smirked when a court officer glanced his way. To anyone watching, he looked like a man who believed the whole proceeding was beneath him. And maybe that confidence came from the story he had been telling since the night his mother stopped breathing. Diane had been sick for years. Her lungs were weak. Her body was failing. Death, he insisted, had simply arrived on schedule. But the prosecution had spent months building a different story. They had assembled timelines, witness statements, autopsy reports, and digital evidence that painted a picture far uglier than natural causes. Diane Mercer had not faded away peacefully in her sleep. She had been silenced by the person she fed, sheltered, and defended long past the point when everyone else had given up on him. The lead prosecutor stood now and moved toward the evidence cart where a laptop sat connected to the courtroom's large display monitor. The screen was still dark, but its presence had already shifted the energy in the room. Evan noticed it too. His smirk faltered for just a second before returning, thinner than before. He had been told what exhibit the state planned to introduce next, but he did not yet understand what it would cost him. He thought the camera footage had been deleted. He thought unplugging the device had been enough. He thought wrong. The prosecutor turned toward the jury and spoke in a voice that carried no drama, only certainty. She explained that the evidence they were about to see had been recovered from a cloud storage account linked to a home security system installed by Diane's daughter just weeks before the murder. The system had been meant to protect Diane from falls, from confusion in the night, from the small dangers that come with age and illness. No one imagined it would end up documenting her final moments. The jury leaned forward slightly. Even the judge, who had seen decades of cases, looked toward the screen with the kind of focus that suggested this moment mattered. Evan shifted in his seat. His lawyer placed a hand on his forearm as if to steady him, but the gesture only made him look more fragile. The confidence he had carried into the courtroom was beginning to crack, and the video had not even started yet. Rachel Mercer sat 3 rows behind the prosecution table and felt her stomach twist. She had already seen parts of the footage during pre-trial meetings, though investigators had spared her the worst of it. Even the sanitized version had been enough to shatter whatever hope she had been holding that maybe somehow this was all a terrible mistake. But it was not a mistake. It was a choice. Her brother had walked into their mother's room in the middle of the night with a pillow in his hand and made a decision that no amount of courtroom performance could undo. Rachel had spent the months since Diane's death replaying every conversation, every warning sign, every moment she had let slide, because confronting Evan felt harder than ignoring him. She had installed the cameras because things were going missing and because her mother had started texting her late at night with messages that felt more like distress signals than updates. But even then, Rachel had not imagined it would come to this. She had thought the cameras might catch theft, maybe manipulation. She had not thought they would catch murder. The prosecutor clicked a button on the laptop and the screen brightened. A timestamp appeared in the corner showing a date from 4 months earlier and a time just after 2 in the morning. The image was black and white, slightly grainy, but clear enough to show the hallway outside Diane's bedroom. The view was static, mounted high on the wall where it could capture movement near the doors. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. The hallway was empty and still, lit only by a small nightlight plugged into an outlet near the floor. Then a figure entered the frame from the left side. Evan Mercer, dressed in a t-shirt and sweatpants, moving slowly down the hallway with something tucked under his arm. The jury watched in silence. A few of them tilted their heads slightly, squinting to make out the object he carried. It was a pillow, standard size, light-colored, the kind found on any bed, in any home. He paused halfway down the hall and glanced back toward the camera. Not directly at it, but near enough that his face was visible for just a moment. His expression was hard to read, somewhere between hesitation and resolve. And then he kept moving. He stopped outside Diane's door and stood there for several seconds. The timestamp ticked forward. The courtroom remained silent except for the faint hum of the projector and the sound of someone shifting in their seat. Then Evan opened the door and stepped inside. The camera could not see into the room, but it captured the door closing most of the way, leaving just a narrow gap of light spilling into the hallway. What happened next could not be seen, only heard. The audio was faint but present, picked up by the camera's microphone designed to detect motion and sound. There was a rustling noise, then a sharper sound like someone inhaling quickly, followed by muffled movement. The sounds were brief and horrible in their implication. Then came a scraping noise, something dragging or shifting against wood. And then silence. The kind of silence that felt louder than anything that had come before it. The jury did not move. Some of them looked down at their notepads. Others kept their eyes locked on the screen, even though there was nothing left to see but an empty hallway and a partially closed door. Minutes passed on the timestamp before the door opened again. Evan emerged, his breathing heavier now, his sleeves slightly twisted. There was a faint mark on his forearm that had not been there before, visible even in the grainy footage. He paused in the hallway and wiped his hands on his shirt, then looked toward the camera again. This time his gaze lingered. He stared at the device for a long moment, and then he walked directly toward it. The image jerked slightly as he reached up, and then the screen went black. The feed had been cut. The prosecutor paused the playback and let the silence settle over the courtroom like weight. She did not need to explain what the jury had just seen. The footage spoke for itself. Evan Mercer had walked into his mother's room in the middle of the night carrying a pillow, and when he came out, Diane Mercer was dead. He had not called for help. He had not checked her pulse or started CPR or done any of the things a panicked son might do upon finding his mother unresponsive. Instead, he had unplugged the camera and walked away. The prosecutor turned back toward the defense table and let her eyes rest on Evan for just a moment longer than necessary. His smirk was gone. His face had gone pale, his jaw tight, his hands folded on the table in front of him, as if holding on to something invisible. For the first time since the trial began, he looked like a man who understood that the story he had been telling was no longer enough. But the camera had remembered what he tried to erase. The cloud had preserved what he thought he had destroyed. And now, in front of 12 strangers who would decide his future, the truth had finally been given a voice. The judge called for a brief recess, and the courtroom emptied slowly, people moving in stunned silence as if the air itself had changed. But the screen remained, dark and still, a reminder that some moments cannot be undone no matter how hard someone tries to bury them. Diane Mercer had been the kind of woman people remembered long after meeting her only once. She had worked for nearly 30 years as a school secretary in a small district outside Columbus, the type of person who knew every student's name and kept a drawer full of bandages, granola bars, and encouraging notes for kids who needed them. Even after retiring, she stayed involved. She volunteered at church fundraisers, mailed birthday cards to neighbors, and showed up to community meetings with homemade cookies that disappeared before the agenda was even discussed. Her world had narrowed in recent years as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease tightened its grip on her lungs, but her instincts had not changed. She still apologized when she needed help. She still worried more about being a burden than about the people who should have been worrying about her. And she still made excuses for her son long after everyone else had stopped believing them. Diane's home was modest but warm, the kind of place that felt lived in without feeling cluttered. The living room centered around a worn recliner positioned near an outlet, where her oxygen concentrator hummed day and night. A clear plastic tube snaked across the carpet and looped around her ears, feeding her lungs the extra air they could no longer pull on their own. On the side table sat her pill organizer, carefully filled every Sunday evening with medications for breathing, blood pressure, and the dozen other small battles her body fought quietly. An inhaler rested within arm's reach. The television stayed on low volume most evenings, filling the silence that had grown since her husband passed years earlier. The kitchen counter held reminders of routine, a grocery list held by a magnet, a calendar marked with doctor's appointments, and a ceramic mug she used for tea every night before bed. It was the home of someone who had made peace with limitations but refused to let them define her completely. Now, Evan had been living there for nearly 2 years by the time Diane died. He had returned after losing another job, another apartment, another relationship that fell apart under the weight of his inability to take responsibility for anything. Diane had told her daughter Rachel that it was temporary, that Evan just needed a few months to get back on his feet, that he was going through something and deserved another chance. Rachel had heard those words before. She had heard them after Evan dropped out of college. She had heard them after he racked up debt he never intended to pay. She had heard them every time Diane smoothed over his failures with the kind of maternal optimism that eventually stops being optimism and becomes denial. But Diane could not help herself. And she had always been the one who believed people could change if given enough support, enough patience, enough love. She extended that belief to Evan longer than anyone else would have, and it cost her everything. The imbalance in the household had been obvious to everyone except Diane. Evan contributed nothing financially. He did not work. He did not help with groceries or utilities or the mounting medical bills that came with Diane's condition. He slept late, stayed up later, and moved through the house like a guest who had long overstayed his welcome but refused to acknowledge it. Diane paid for his car insurance, even though he rarely drove her anywhere. She bought food he ate without thanking her. She washed his clothes and folded them neatly on his bed as if he were still a teenager, incapable of managing his own life. And when Rachel or other family members suggested that maybe it was time for Evan to stand on his own, Diane defended him with the same tired script. He was struggling. He was trying. He just needed more time. The truth was simpler and uglier. Evan was not struggling. He was comfortable. And he had no intention of leaving as long as his mother kept enabling him. Rachel Mercer had seen the pattern clearly because she lived outside of it. She was a nurse, pragmatic, and trained to recognize when care turned into harm. She visited her mother twice a week and noticed things Diane tried to downplay. Money going missing from Diane's purse. Medications that ran out faster than they should have. Tension in the house that Diane blamed on her own health rather than on the 30-year-old man who treated her home like a free hotel. Rachel had tried intervening gently at first, suggesting that Evan look into job programs or temporary housing assistance, but he reacted to every suggestion like an accusation. He would snap at Diane, complain that everyone was turning her against him, and then retreat into wounded silence until Diane apologized for causing conflict. It was a cycle Rachel recognized from textbooks and training sessions about manipulation and control. The problem was that recognizing it did not mean she could stop it. Diane would not abandon Evan, no matter how much damage he caused, and Evan knew it. Then Diane started talking about change. It began quietly, almost as if she were testing the idea aloud before committing to it. She mentioned to Rachel during a phone call that maybe it was time to think about moving closer to medical support, or perhaps into an assisted living community, or even into Rachel's home where help would be more accessible. She talked about reviewing her finances and making sure everything was organized in case her health took a sudden turn. She even scheduled an appointment with her lawyer to update her will, adjust her beneficiary designations, and remove Evan's access to her bank account. The appointment was set for a Monday morning in late autumn. Diane had written it on the kitchen calendar in blue ink and circled it twice. She had not told Evan directly, but she had stopped pretending that the current arrangement could continue indefinitely. For the first time in years, Diane was preparing to set a boundary. And for Evan, that boundary looked like the end of everything he had been taking for granted. There was a moment, small and domestic, 'tis that Rachel would remember long after the trial ended. She had stopped by one evening to drop off groceries and found Diane in the laundry room folding towels. Diane moved slowly, pausing every few minutes to catch her breath, her hands working methodically through the warm pile of fabric. She pulled out a towel, folded it neatly, and set it aside on a separate stack. Rachel asked who it was for. Diane said it was for Evan, that he had mentioned needing a clean one for his bathroom. Rachel felt a spike of frustration but said nothing. She just watched her mother, 64 years old and struggling to breathe, still taking care of a grown man who had never once folded a towel for her. It was such a small thing, so easy to dismiss as unimportant, but it captured everything wrong about the relationship. Diane gave and gave until there was nothing left to give, and Evan took until there was nothing left to take. That imbalance had defined their lives for years. Soon it would define her death. On the refrigerator, beneath a magnet shaped like a sunflower, hung a small card printed with an appointment reminder. Monday, 10:30 in the morning, estate and care planning. Diane had placed it there herself, visible every time she opened the fridge for her morning juice or her evening medication. She had not hidden it. She had not been secretive. She had simply decided that her life needed to change before her health made the decision for her. Evan had seen the card. He had asked what it was for. Diane had told him gently that she needed to make sure her affairs were in order, and that some things would have to shift going forward. She did not say she was cutting him off. She did not say she was kicking him out. But Evan heard the threat anyway. He heard it in her tone, in the careful way she avoided his eyes, in the fact that she had stopped asking him what his plans were and started making her own. That card stayed on the refrigerator for 3 days. On the fourth night, Diane Mercer stopped breathing, and by morning, the card no longer mattered. Rachel Mercer had installed the cameras on a Saturday afternoon in early October, just 3 weeks before her mother died. She had been thinking about it for months, but kept putting it off because Diane hated the idea of being watched in her own home. Diane had always been private, the kind of person who closed the bathroom door even when she lived alone. And the thought of cameras recording her movements felt invasive, no matter how Rachel framed it. But then Diane fell one night trying to reach the kitchen for water, and she did not call anyone for help until morning because she did not want to bother Rachel at 2 a.m. When Rachel found out, she stopped asking permission and simply showed up with 2 small indoor cameras still in their boxes. She told her mother it was not about surveillance, it was about safety. If Diane fell again, if her oxygen levels dropped, if anything went wrong in the middle of the night, Rachel would know immediately. Diane agreed reluctantly, more to stop the argument than because she believed it was necessary. The installation took less than an hour. Rachel mounted one camera in the hallway just outside Diane's bedroom, our angle to capture the doorway and the path to the bathroom where most falls happened. The second camera went in the kitchen, positioned to cover the main walkway and the back door. Both devices were small, unobtrusive, and connected to the home's wireless internet. Rachel downloaded the companion app on her phone and walked Diane through the basics. The cameras were motion-activated, meaning they only recorded when someone moved through the frame. The clips were short, usually 15 to 30 seconds, and they uploaded automatically to a cloud storage account that kept footage for 30 days before deleting it. Rachel showed Diane how a notification would ping her phone whenever motion was detected, and she promised she would not be watching constantly, only checking in if something seemed off. Diane nodded and said she understood. But Rachel could tell her mother still felt uncomfortable. She left that afternoon hoping the cameras would never be needed for anything more serious than peace of mind. Evan hated the cameras from the moment he noticed them. He came home later that evening and spotted the small black device mounted near the ceiling in the hallway. He asked Diane what it was, and when she explained, he laughed in a way that sounded more like contempt than amusement. He called them babysitters. He said Rachel was treating them like criminals. He asked if his own sister really thought so little of him that she needed to put him under surveillance in his mother's house. Diane tried to calm him down, explaining again that the cameras were for her safety, not for monitoring him, but Evan would not let it go. He paced the hallway staring up at the device, muttering about privacy and trust and how the whole family had turned against him. The reaction was outsized for what should have been a minor inconvenience, but that was typical of Evan. Any boundary, any limit, any suggestion that his behavior might be worth questioning was treated as a personal attack. He spent the rest of the evening sulking in his room, and Diane spent it apologizing to no one in particular for causing more tension. What Evan did not understand, or chose not to understand, was how the cameras actually worked. He knew they were there. He knew they recorded movement, but he believed the footage stayed on the devices themselves, stored locally on some kind of internal memory that could be erased by simply unplugging the units or removing them from the wall. He had grown up in an era of smartphones and cloud storage, but his understanding of technology was shallow and shaped more by convenience than comprehension. He assumed that destroying the physical device would destroy the evidence, the same way deleting a text message made it disappear from his phone. He did not know that every time the cameras detected motion, a short clip was uploaded wirelessly to a secure server hundreds of miles away. He did not know that even if he unplugged every camera in the house, the footage that had already been captured would remain accessible through Rachel's account for weeks. That ignorance would become the gap between what he thought he had done and what he had actually left behind. The cameras recorded mundane life for the first 2 weeks. Diane moving slowly down the hallway in the morning. Saw Evan passing through the kitchen late at night to grab food from the refrigerator. Diane pausing to catch her breath. Evan scrolling on his phone. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth reviewing. Rachel checked the app occasionally, mostly out of habit, and saw exactly what she expected. Her mother managing her routines, her brother treating the house like his personal space, and no emergencies that required intervention. The notifications became background noise. She stopped opening every alert and only glanced at her phone if something seemed unusual. The system was working exactly as intended, which meant it faded into the background of daily life. But the cameras kept recording. They kept uploading. And they kept building a silent archive of everything that happened inside that house, waiting for the moment when silence would matter more than sound. Then came the final argument. It happened 3 days before Diane died, late in the evening after she had returned from a follow-up appointment with her pulmonologist. The doctor had told her that her condition was stable but not improving, and that if she wanted to maintain her quality of life, she needed to reduce stress and ensure she had consistent support nearby. Diane came home and told Evan, as gently as she could, that she had been thinking seriously about making some changes. She did not say she was kicking him out. She did not say she was cutting him off. She simply said that things could not continue the way they had been, and that she needed to make decisions about her future while she still could. Evan exploded. He accused her of listening to Rachel instead of trusting him. He said she was treating him like a burden when all he had ever done was try to help. He raised his voice loud enough that a neighbor 2 houses down heard it through an open window and later mentioned it to police. Diane tried to de-escalate. She told him she was not trying to hurt him, that she just needed to think about her health and her safety and what would happen if she got worse. But Evan did not want explanations. He wanted control. He wanted the house to stay exactly as it was, with Diane covering his expenses and asking nothing in return and never threatening to take away the one stable thing he had. The argument ended when Evan stormed out of the kitchen and slammed his bedroom door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the hallway wall. Diane sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time afterward, her hands shaking slightly, her breathing labored. She picked up her phone and sent Rachel a text message. It was short and simple, the kind of message that feels routine until it becomes the last communication someone ever sends. It said, "He's angry. Call me in the morning." Rachel saw the message before bed and replied that she would check in first thing. She did not know that by morning there would be no one left to call. The cameras captured pieces of that night. Diane moving through the hallway toward her bedroom just after 11. The lights going off in the kitchen. The house settling into the kind of quiet that should have meant rest. Then, hours later, at 11:48, the hallway camera recorded Diane's bedroom door opening briefly before closing again. The motion was quick, just a few seconds, but it triggered the system. A 15-second clip uploaded to the cloud. Rachel's phone buzzed with a notification, but she was already asleep and did not see it until the next day. The camera stayed active, waiting for the next movement, the next sound, the next moment worth preserving. It did not have to wait long. Just after 2 a.m, the hallway camera detected motion again. This time, it was not Diane. It was Evan. And this time, the footage would not fade into the background. It would become the single most important piece of evidence in a murder trial. The small red recording light blinked steadily in the darkness, patient and unblinking, capturing everything the man in the hallway thought he could hide. The house was quiet in the way only suburban homes can be at 2 a.m. The furnace clicked on periodically, pushing warm air through the vents with a low mechanical hum. Diane's oxygen concentrator ran constantly in her bedroom, a steady rhythmic sound that had become part of the household's background noise. Outside, the street was empty. Porch lights glowed at regular intervals down the block, but no cars passed and no dogs barked. It was the kind of neighborhood where people went to bed early and trusted that morning would arrive without incident. Inside the Mercer house, that trust was about to be shattered in a way no one would have predicted, though perhaps some should have seen coming. Evan sat in his bedroom with the lights off, staring at his phone screen. The glow illuminated his face in the darkness, casting shadows that made his expression hard to read. On the screen were reminders he could not ignore. Overdraft notices from his bank account, past due warnings on a credit card he had maxed out months ago, a string of messages from someone asking when he was going to pay back money he had borrowed with no intention of returning. His financial situation had been deteriorating for years, but it had reached a point where ignoring it was no longer possible. He had no income, no savings, no plan beyond continuing to live off his mother's limited resources while she paid for everything he needed and asked for nothing in return. That arrangement had worked as long as Diane stayed passive, as long as she kept excusing him, as long as she prioritized his comfort over her own future. But that was about to change, and Evan knew it. The appointment card on the refrigerator haunted him more than any debt notice. Monday morning, estate and care planning. Those words represented the end of everything he had been relying on. Diane had not spelled out exactly what she intended to do, but Evan understood the implications. She was going to cut off his access to her bank account. She was going to remove him from any inheritance or financial safety net. She was going to make it clear that he could no longer live in her house indefinitely without contributing anything. Worse, she might move out entirely, either into assisted living or into Rachel's home, and then Evan would lose the roof over his head, along with everything else. The thought filled him with a rage that had been building for weeks, a resentment that blamed everyone except himself. He had convinced himself that he was the victim in this situation, that his mother and sister were conspiring to punish him for struggles that were not his fault. That distortion made what came next feel almost justified in his mind. He opened his phone's browser and typed a search into the bar. The phrasing was careful, the kind of question someone asks when they are testing an idea rather than committing to it. He searched for whether respiratory disease could cause sudden death overnight. Then he searched for whether someone with chronic lung problems could pass away naturally without warning. He deleted the searches immediately after reading the results, but deletion on a device does not mean erasure. The queries were still logged, still recoverable, and still waiting in the phone's memory like breadcrumbs that would later lead investigators directly to intent. He kept searching. He wanted to know if smothering left marks that could be detected during an autopsy. He wanted to know how long it took for security camera footage to be deleted. He wanted to know if a sick person's death would automatically be ruled natural without further investigation. Each search built on the last, forming a pattern that was impossible to explain away as curiosity or coincidence. Around 2 a.m, Evan stood up. He had been sitting in the dark for over an hour, scrolling and thinking and letting the anger harden into something colder. He opened his bedroom door slowly and stepped into the hallway. The house was still. Diane's door was closed, a thin line of light visible underneath from the lamp she kept on at night because darkness made her anxious. Evan stood outside her door for a long moment, listening. He could hear the faint sound of the television, the oxygen machine, and nothing else. She was asleep or close to it. He went to the hallway closet and pulled a pillow from the top shelf, one of the spare pillows Diane kept for guests who no longer visited. He held it under his arm and walked back toward her room. The hallway camera, mounted near the ceiling, recorded every step. He hesitated outside her door. The timestamp on the footage would later show that he stood there for nearly 20 seconds, shifting his weight, adjusting his grip on the pillow, perhaps giving himself one last chance to turn back. But he did not turn back. He opened the door and stepped inside. The camera could not see past the doorway, but it captured the sound. Diane's voice, startled and confused, asking what he was doing. A rustling noise as blankets shifted. A sudden muffled gasp. Then the sound of something heavier, a scrape against the wooden headboard, labored breathing that was not Evan's. The audio was faint but unmistakable. It lasted less than a minute, though to anyone listening later it would feel much longer. Then came silence, not the peaceful silence of sleep, but the terrible absence of sound that follows violence. Evan emerged from the room a few minutes later. His breathing was heavier now, his face flushed, his sleeves twisted out of place. There was a faint red mark on his forearm, the kind of mark that comes from someone grabbing in desperation, trying to fight back with whatever strength they have left. He did not look toward the camera immediately. He walked to the bathroom first, turned on the light, and stood at the sink. The kitchen camera did not have an angle on the bathroom, but it captured him walking past a few moments later with his hands still damp, his expression carefully blank. He moved through the house with the kind of focused calm that comes not from panic, but from purpose. He wiped down surfaces in the hallway. He adjusted the pillow on Diane's bed, placing it near her head in a way that might look natural if no one examined too closely. He checked his phone, and then he walked back into the hallway, looked directly up at the camera, and reached toward it. The screen went black. He had unplugged the device, pulling it free from the wall outlet that powered it. In his mind, that action had erased the evidence. So he believed that disconnecting the camera meant the footage was gone, that without power, the device held nothing, that he had successfully eliminated the one witness to what had just happened. He did not know that every motion-triggered clip had already uploaded wirelessly to a cloud server the moment it was recorded. He did not know that the 15-second segments from the hallway, the audio from inside Diane's room, and the clear image of him holding a pillow were already stored hundreds of miles away in a digital archive he could not touch. He thought he had been clever. He thought he had covered his tracks. He thought his mother's illness would do the rest of the work for him, providing a ready-made explanation that no one would question. He went to the kitchen, made himself something to eat, and sat at the table in the dark, waiting. He did not call for help. He did not check on his mother. He simply waited for enough time to pass so that when he finally dialed 911, the story he told would sound believable. The call came in at 4:37 in the morning. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, her voice practiced and steady, ready for whatever emergency was about to unfold. On the other end of the line was Evan Mercer, and the first thing she noticed was how calm he sounded. Not panicked, not crying, not breathless with fear. Just calm, as if he were reporting a problem with his cable service rather than the death of his mother. He told the dispatcher that his mom was not breathing. He said he had just woken up and gone to check on her and found her unresponsive in bed. The dispatcher asked if he had started CPR. Evan said no, said that it was too late, that she was already gone. The dispatcher pressed him, asking how he knew, asking if he had checked for a pulse, asking if he was willing to try chest compressions while help was on the way. Evan hesitated and then said he did not think it would help. She had been very sick, he added. She had lung problems. This was probably just her time. That phrase landed strangely with the dispatcher. Her time was not the kind of language someone typically used in the middle of a crisis unless they had already accepted the death before calling for help. The dispatcher made a note of it and continued with her questions. She asked when he had last seen his mother alive. Evan paused, then said he thought it was around 11 the night before when she went to bed. The dispatcher asked if he had heard anything unusual during the night. Evan said no, that he had been asleep. She asked if there were any signs of distress, any sounds of coughing or struggling. Evan said he had not heard anything at all. That answer would later become one of many small inconsistencies that made investigators uneasy. Diane's oxygen machine was loud. Her bedroom was close to Evan's. If she had been in any kind of medical distress serious enough to cause death, there should have been noise. But Evan claimed to have heard nothing. First responders arrived within 8 minutes. 2 paramedics and a fire department crew pulled up to the Modest home just as the sky was beginning to lighten. Evan met them at the front door, dressed in sweatpants and a wrinkled shirt. his face carefully arranged into something that resembled shock but did not quite reach his eyes. He led them down the hallway to Diane's bedroom, and the moment they stepped inside, the paramedics exchanged a glance. Something about the scene felt wrong. Diane was lying in bed on her back, her arms at her sides, her head resting on the pillow in a way that looked almost posed. The oxygen tubing was still looped around her ears, but had come loose from the machine. The blankets were pulled up neatly to her chest. It looked too organized for someone who had died in distress. One of the paramedics leaned down to check for a pulse and confirm what was already obvious. Diane Mercer was dead, and based on the temperature of her skin, she had been dead for hours. The lead paramedic turned to Evan and asked again when he had last checked on his mother. Evan repeated that it was around 11, maybe midnight, when she went to bed. The paramedic asked why he had waited until 4:30 to call if he suspected something was wrong. Evan said he had not suspected anything. He said he just woke up and had a feeling he should check on her. That explanation did not sit well with anyone in the room. People do not wake up at 4:30 in the morning with a sudden urge to check on a sleeping parent unless something has prompted it. A noise, a concern, a disturbance. But Evan insisted there had been nothing. He had just woken up and walked down the hall and found her like this. The paramedics did not challenge him directly, but they made detailed notes about the timeline, the condition of the room, and Evan's demeanor. All of it would be passed along to the responding police officers, who arrived a few minutes later. The officers began with routine questions, the kind asked at any sudden death scene. They asked about Diane's medical history. Evan explained her chronic lung disease, her reliance on oxygen, her medications, and her recent doctor visits. He made sure to emphasize how sick she had been, how weak, how her doctors had told her that her condition could worsen at any time. He framed her death as inevitable, something that had been waiting to happen regardless of what anyone did or did not do. The officers nodded and took notes, but one of them noticed the scratches on Evan's forearm. They were fresh, red, and slightly raised, the kind of marks that come from fingernails dragging across skin. The officer asked how he had gotten them. Evan glanced down as if noticing them for the first time and said he must have scratched himself in his sleep. He was a restless sleeper, he explained. It happened all the time. The officer made a note and moved on, but the explanation felt rehearsed. Rachel arrived shortly after 5 in the morning, her face pale and her hands shaking as she rushed through the front door. She had received a call from a police officer telling her that her mother had passed away during the night and that she needed to come to the house. Rachel went straight to Diane's bedroom and stopped in the doorway. She did not need to be a nurse to see that something was wrong. The room looked disturbed despite its outward neatness. The pillow that should have been under Diane's head was on the floor near the foot of the bed. But the oxygen tubing was twisted in a way that did not make sense if Diane had simply gone to sleep and not woken up. The blankets were pulled up too high, covering her shoulders in a way Diane never slept because it made her feel trapped. Rachel turned to the officer standing nearby and said, "This does not look right." The officer asked what she meant. Rachel gestured around the room and said her mother would not have arranged things this way. Someone else had been in here. Evan stood in the hallway, listening to his sister question the scene. His expression shifted from carefully neutral to irritated. He stepped into the doorway and told Rachel she was being ridiculous, that their mother had died peacefully in her sleep, and she needed to accept it instead of making things harder for everyone. Rachel turned on him, on her grief sharpening into anger. She asked why he had waited so long to call for help. She asked why the room looked staged. She asked why he was not crying, why he was not devastated, why he seemed more annoyed than heartbroken. Evan told her she was being emotional and irrational, that grief was making her see things that were not there. But Rachel did not back down. She told the officers that her brother had been living off their mother for years, that there had been tension in the house, and that Diane had been planning to make changes that would have affected Evan's living situation. That statement changed the tone of the conversation. What had started as a routine sudden death response was now edged with suspicion. A neighbor who had been interviewed at the door mentioned hearing raised voices late the previous evening, maybe around 9 or 10. Another neighbor recalled seeing Evan take the trash out well before dawn, which struck them as odd because trash pickup was not until later in the week. The officers asked Evan about the argument. He minimized it, saying it was just a normal family disagreement, nothing serious, nothing worth remembering. They asked about the trash. He said he could not sleep and decided to do something productive. Every answer was plausible on its own, but taken together, they formed a pattern that made the responding officers uneasy. One of them stepped outside and called for a supervisor. When the sergeant arrived, he walked through the house slowly, looked at the scratches on Evan's arm, reviewed the timeline, and made a decision. The death would not be certified as natural at the scene. It would be marked as suspicious pending a full autopsy and investigation. That procedural decision became the first crack in the story Evan had been trying to build, and the crack would only widen from there. As the medical examiner's team arrived to transport Diane's body, one of the crime scene technicians noticed the small camera mounted in the hallway. It was unplugged, the cord hanging loose against the wall. The technician asked who had installed it. Rachel explained that she had put it up a few weeks earlier for her mother's safety. The technician asked if it recorded footage. Rachel said yes, that it was supposed to upload clips to a cloud account whenever it detected motion. The technician bagged the camera as evidence and made a note to follow up on the digital storage. Evan, standing a few feet away, went very still. His face did not change, but something in his posture shifted. He had thought unplugging the device had been enough. He had thought the footage was gone. But now a crime scene technician was holding the camera in a clear plastic bag, and someone was talking about cloud storage, and the careful story he had constructed was beginning to fall apart before he even realized how badly he had miscalculated. The white pillow disappeared into an evidence bag. The oxygen machine continued its empty hum, and in the growing daylight, the house that had once been Diane Mercer's refuge became the center of a homicide investigation. The autopsy was scheduled for late morning the following day, and by the time the medical examiner began her work, rumors about the case had already started circulating among law enforcement. A son living off his sick mother. A suspicious timeline. Fresh scratches. An unplugged camera. None of it proved murder, but all of it pointed away from the easy conclusion that Evan Mercer wanted everyone to accept. The medical examiner, Dr. Laura Hines, had seen hundreds of deaths during her career, and she had learned long ago not to let family narratives or pre-existing conditions cloud her judgment. Her job was not to confirm what someone hoped had happened. Her job was to determine what actually had happened, and she approached Diane Mercer's body with that principle firmly in mind. Diane had been sick, yes. Her medical records showed years of progressive lung disease, reduced capacity, and increasing dependence on supplemental oxygen. But sickness and death are not always synonyms, and doctor. Hines knew that fragile people are sometimes murdered precisely because their killers believe illness will camouflage the crime. The external examination came first. Diane's body showed signs consistent with chronic illness, weight loss, muscle atrophy, and the kind of frailty that comes from years of fighting a losing battle against disease. But there were other signs, too, signs that had nothing to do with her medical history. Faint bruising around her mouth and nose, barely visible but present under the right lighting. Petechial hemorrhages in the whites of her eyes, tiny red dots caused by burst capillaries that often appear when someone has been deprived of oxygen violently rather than gradually. Bruising along the inner lining of her lips, the kind caused by pressure from the outside pushing soft tissue against teeth. These were not the markers of someone who had simply stopped breathing in her sleep. These were the markers of someone who had fought, however weakly, to keep breathing while someone else made sure she could not. Dr. Hines moved to the internal examination. She documented soft tissue damage in the neck, minor but present, consistent with compression. The hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that often fractures during strangulation, was intact, which was not surprising given that smothering involves blocking the airway rather than crushing the neck. But there was hemorrhaging in the surrounding tissue, evidence that force had been applied. The lungs showed the expected damage from years of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, scarring and inflammation that had made every breath a labor. But the cause of death was not the disease itself. The lungs had not simply given out. They had been denied air. Dr. Hines noted pooling of blood in areas consistent with someone lying flat while still alive and struggling, and lividity patterns that matched the position Diane had been found in. The science was adding up piece by piece into a conclusion that left no room for accident or natural decline. Toxicology results came back within days, and they narrowed the possibilities even further. Diane's medications were present in her system at therapeutic levels, exactly where they should have been if she had been taking them as prescribed. There was no overdose, no unexpected substances, no chemical explanation for her death. If Evan or his defense team had been hoping for a convenient toxicological finding that could muddy the waters, they would not get it. The drugs in her system were the ones meant to keep her alive, not the ones that would have ended her life. That left only one category of explanation: mechanical asphyxiation. Someone had blocked her ability to breathe, held that obstruction long enough for her weakened body to give out, and then arranged the scene to look like she had passed quietly in her sleep. It was a crime that relied on the victim's vulnerability, and Dr. Hines had seen it before. Fragile victims are often targeted because their killers assume no one will look closely enough to see past the obvious frailty. Dr. Hines drafted her report with clinical precision. Cause of death: asphyxiation due to smothering. Manner of death: homicide. She noted the presence of petechial hemorrhages, oral bruising, soft tissue injury, but then the absence of any natural disease process acute enough to explain sudden death. She acknowledged Diane's underlying medical conditions, but made clear that those conditions had not killed her that night. In a separate section, she addressed the question she knew would come up at trial. Could a woman with severe lung disease have died naturally in a way that mimicked smothering? Her answer was direct. The pattern of injuries, the absence of any cardiac event or respiratory crisis, and the physical evidence of force all pointed to homicide. Natural death from chronic illness does not leave bruises inside the mouth. It does not cause petechial hemorrhaging. It does not explain why a pillow was found on the floor instead of under the victim's head. The science was unambiguous, and Dr. Hines was prepared to defend it in court if necessary. When investigators received the finalized autopsy report, the case officially shifted from suspicious death to murder investigation. Detectives who had been moving cautiously, gathering background information, and waiting for medical clarity, now had the legal foundation they needed to move aggressively. Search warrants were drafted for the Mercer home, for Evan's phone, for his computer, and for any financial records tied to Diane's accounts. The trash Evan had taken out before dawn was retrieved from the waste management facility and searched for anything he might have tried to discard. Investigators interviewed neighbors again, this time with more pointed questions. They pulled records from Diane's bank, her lawyer's office, and her medical providers. They requested access to the cloud storage account linked to the home security cameras, and they began the process of extracting every piece of digital evidence Evan had touched in the days leading up to his mother's death. The investigation was no longer asking whether Evan was suspicious. It was building a case to prove he was guilty. Rachel was notified of the autopsy findings by a detective who called her at work. She had been expecting it on some level, had known from the moment she saw her mother's room that this was not a natural death, but hearing the word homicide spoken aloud still hit her like a physical blow. She sat down in an empty conference room and cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry since the night Diane died. Her mother had not simply passed away. She had been killed. She had been scared. Why, she had struggled, and the person who did it was the same person Diane had fed, sheltered, and defended for years. The cruelty of that betrayal was almost too large to process. Rachel thought about all the times she had warned her mother, all the times Diane had made excuses, all the ways Evan had manipulated the one person who refused to stop believing in him. And now that person was gone, and Evan was still walking around free, still telling lies, still acting like he was the victim in a story where he was the only perpetrator. The manner of death ruling changed everything. What had been a family tragedy was now a criminal case, and the evidence that had seemed circumstantial was now being re-examined through the lens of homicide. The scratches on Evan's arm were no longer dismissed as coincidental. In the delayed 911 call was no longer attributed to shock. The staged bedroom scene was no longer considered a matter of interpretation. Every detail that had felt slightly off now fit into a larger, uglier picture. Diane Mercer had been murdered by her own son in the middle of the night, and he had tried to use her illness as cover. He had counted on people assuming that sick meant dying, that weakness meant inevitability, that a body already compromised would not be examined closely enough to reveal the truth. But Dr. Hines had refused to take the easy answer. She had looked at the evidence without bias, followed the science without compromise, and given Diane the one thing Evan had tried to take away from her: a voice. The autopsy report, stamped and signed, sat on the lead detective's desk. On the final page, or in a box labeled "Manner of Death," the word "homicide" was typed in bold letters. There was no ambiguity left, only accountability waiting to be delivered. The search warrant for Evan Mercer's phone was executed 3 days after the autopsy report came back. Detectives arrived at the house early in the morning with a team of forensic technicians and a list of items they intended to seize. Evan was still living there, despite Rachel's objections and the growing tension between them. He answered the door in pajama pants and a stained shirt, his hair uncombed, his expression shifting from annoyance to alarm when he saw the number of people standing on the porch. The lead detective handed him the warrant and explained calmly that they would be taking his phone, his laptop, any tablets or external drives, and access to his online accounts. Evan protested immediately. He said they had no right to invade his privacy. He said his mother had died of natural causes, and this was all a massive overreach. The detective did not argue. He simply pointed to the section of the warrant that listed homicide investigation as the legal basis and told Evan he could either hand over the devices voluntarily or watch them be taken by force. Evan handed over his phone. The forensic extraction began that same afternoon in a lab downtown. A digital analyst connected Evan's phone to a specialized computer system designed to pull data from locked or encrypted devices. The process took hours, copying everything stored in the phone's memory, including text messages, call logs, photos, app data, browser history, and even information the user believed had been deleted. Modern phones retain far more than most people realize. Deleted texts leave traces. Cleared browser histories leave fragments. Every search, every click, every moment of activity creates a digital footprint that professional tools can recover. By the time the extraction finished, the analyst had a complete map of Evan's digital life going back months. What they found was not evidence of grief or panic or a son trying desperately to save his mother. What they found was evidence of planning, motive, and a conscience that had stopped functioning long before Diane took her last breath. The search history was damning in its specificity. Starting 2 weeks before Diane's death, Evan had begun researching scenarios that aligned almost exactly with what would eventually happen. He had searched whether someone with severe lung disease could die suddenly without warning. He had searched whether smothering could be detected during an autopsy. He had searched how long it took for security cameras to delete footage automatically. He had searched whether a death could be ruled natural if the person was already sick. Each query had been deleted within minutes of being entered, but deletion does not erase the underlying data. The phone's operating system kept logs. The search engine kept records. The internet service provider kept timestamps. Every question Evan thought he had hidden was still there, waiting to be recovered and presented as proof that this was not a moment of anger or a tragic accident. This was premeditated murder disguised as mercy. The financial records added depth to the motive. Investigators pulled Evan's bank statements and found an account that had been overdrawn repeatedly over the previous 6 months. Charges for online gambling sites, cash advances from credit cards, purchases that suggested someone living well beyond his means while contributing nothing to the household that supported him. Then they pulled Diane's bank records and saw a pattern that made the detectives' stomachs turn. Small withdrawals made with her debit card, always just under the amount that might trigger a fraud alert, nearly every week for the past year. Payments to Evan's creditors made directly from Diane's checking account. Transfers that Diane had probably authorized under pressure, believing that helping her son one more time would finally turn things around. The records painted a picture of financial abuse that had been going on long before the night Diane died, and they showed exactly what Evan stood to lose if she followed through on cutting him off. More damaging still was the activity from after Diane was already dead. At 4:15 in the morning, roughly 2 hours before Evan called 911, his phone showed him accessing Diane's banking app using saved login credentials. He had tried to initiate a transfer from her savings account to his checking account. The transaction failed because the bank's fraud detection system flagged it as suspicious due to the unusual time and amount. But the attempt was logged, time-stamped, and saved. That single action destroyed any remaining possibility that Evan had been in shock or acting out of panic. A man who had just lost his mother does not try to move her money into his own account before calling for help. A man who had just committed murder and needed to secure his financial future does exactly that. The timing alone was enough to prove that Evan's priorities in the hours after Diane's death had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with control. Text messages provided additional context. Evan had been messaging a friend intermittently over the weeks leading up to Diane's death, and the tone of those messages was cold enough to make even experienced investigators uncomfortable. He complained about living under the same roof as someone who was always sick and always complaining. He referred to his mother as a burden who made his life harder than it needed to be. And he wrote that he was tired of waiting for things to change and that he wished he could just move on already. None of the messages explicitly stated an intent to kill, but taken together with the search history and the financial motive, they revealed a mindset that had dehumanized Diane to the point where her death became an acceptable solution to his problems. The friend who received the messages was interviewed and admitted that Evan had seemed increasingly frustrated in the months before Diane died, though the friend claimed not to have taken the complaints seriously at the time. Phone location data added another layer of proof. Investigators compared the timestamps on Evan's device activity with movement logs tracked by the phone's internal sensors and nearby cell towers. During the window when Evan claimed to have been asleep, his phone showed no activity consistent with rest. Instead, it showed periodic screen unlocks, browser searches, and movement through the house. The phone had been in the hallway at 2:13 in the morning, exactly matching the time the security camera captured Evan walking toward Diane's room with a pillow. It had been in the kitchen minutes later, matching the timeline prosecutors would later present as the period when Evan cleaned up and prepared his story. The data did not lie. It did not forget. And it did not care about the excuses Evan would try to offer. His phone had been a silent witness to every step he took that night, and now it was testifying against him. The forensic team compiled everything into a detailed report that ran over 80 pages. Search queries, financial transactions, text messages, location data, app usage patterns, deleted files recovered and time-stamped. The report was dense and technical, but its conclusion was simple. Evan Mercer had spent weeks researching how to get away with murder, had financial and personal motives to want his mother dead, and had behaved in the hours after her death like someone managing a crime scene rather than grieving a loss. When the lead detective finished reading the report, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. They had known Evan was guilty from the moment the autopsy came back, but knowing and proving are two different standards. Now they had proof. Digital, time-stamped, unambiguous proof. The kind that juries understand and defense attorneys cannot explain away. The extraction progress bar on the computer screen reached 100%. The phone had finished talking. And what it said was enough to bury the man who thought he had been clever enough to delete the truth. The investigation widened as detectives moved beyond the physical and digital evidence to build a picture of the household Diane and Evan had shared in the months leading up to her death. Murder cases are not won on forensics alone. Juries need context. They need to understand why someone would do something so unthinkable, and that understanding comes from witnesses who saw the pressure building long before it exploded. Investigators fanned out across the community, interviewing family members, neighbors, medical providers, and anyone who had regular contact with Diane or Evan. What emerged was a portrait of a relationship that had been toxic for years, a son who took everything and gave nothing, and a mother who kept making excuses until she finally ran out of time to stop him. Every interview added another piece to the puzzle, and every piece pointed in the same direction. Rachel Mercer was the first and most important witness. She sat across from detectives in a small conference room and answered questions for nearly 3 hours, her voice steady, but her hands shaking as she recounted years of watching her brother manipulate their mother. Rachel explained that Evan had always been the problem child, the one who could not hold a job, could not maintain relationships, and could not take responsibility for his own failures. Diane had enabled him out of love and misplaced hope, believing that one more chance would be the one that finally turned things around. Rachel had tried to intervene multiple times, suggesting boundaries, offering to help Evan find resources, even offering to let Diane move in with her so she would not have to carry the burden alone. But Diane had refused every time, insisting that Evan needed her and that abandoning him would make her a bad mother. Rachel's voice broke when she described the appointment Diane had scheduled for the Monday after she died. Diane had finally been ready to make changes, and Evan had made sure she never got the chance. Diane's attorney, Margaret Feldman, confirmed what Rachel had described. Diane had called her office 2 weeks before her death and scheduled a consultation to update her estate documents. During a brief phone conversation, Diane had mentioned that she needed to remove her son from certain financial accounts and adjust her will to reflect the reality that he was not capable of managing money responsibly. She had also asked about the process for establishing a trust that would provide for her care without giving Evan direct access to her funds. Margaret had noted the stress in Diane's voice and had offered to move the appointment up if it was urgent. Diane had said no, that the scheduled date would be fine, but that she wanted to make sure everything was handled properly because there was going to be conflict. Those words, "there was going to be conflict," became significant when investigators realized that Diane had understood the risk she was taking. She had known Evan would not accept losing access to her money quietly, and she had been right. But neighbors provided additional texture. A woman who lived 2 doors down recalled hearing raised voices coming from the Mercer house several times over the past few months, usually late in the evening. She could not make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, frustration, someone losing control. Another neighbor remembered seeing Evan outside at odd hours, pacing in the driveway, or sitting in his car with the engine running as if he were trying to calm down or escape something. A man who walked his dog past the house every morning said he had noticed that Diane stopped coming outside as much in the weeks before she died, and when he asked if she was all right, she had smiled weakly and said she was just tired. None of the neighbors had suspected anything criminal, but all of them had sensed that something in that house was wrong. Their statements would help establish that the Mercer household had been a pressure cooker and that Evan had been the source of the heat. Medical records added another dimension. Diane's primary care physician and pulmonologist were both interviewed, and both confirmed that while Diane's lung disease was serious, it was stable. She was not in acute decline. She was not on the verge of sudden death. Her doctors had advised her to reduce stress, maintain her medication schedule, and consider transitioning to a living situation with more support. But none of them had given her a terminal prognosis or suggested that she was at risk of dying unexpectedly. And that medical testimony would become critical at trial because it undermined the defense's likely argument that Diane's death was simply the natural endpoint of a chronic illness. Her doctors would testify that she should have had months, possibly years, left. Evan had stolen that time, and the medical evidence would prove it. Pharmacy records revealed another troubling pattern. Diane's prescriptions for pain medication and anti-anxiety drugs had been refilled more frequently than her dosage should have required. When investigators cross-referenced the refill dates with Diane's medical appointments, they found discrepancies that suggested someone else had been taking her medication. Evan had no prescription for controlled substances of his own, but he had access to Diane's pills and no oversight to stop him from helping himself. A pharmacist who had filled Diane's prescriptions for years recalled a conversation in which Diane had mentioned that she thought some of her medication was going missing, but she had not wanted to accuse anyone or make a big deal out of it. The pharmacist had suggested she keep her pills in a locked box, but Diane had never followed up. That small detail painted a picture of a woman who suspected her son was stealing from her but could not bring herself to confront him directly. It was a pattern of avoidance that had ultimately cost her everything. Detectives also interviewed a friend of Evan's, a man named Kyle who had known him since high school. Kyle was reluctant to talk at first, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of providing information that might be used against someone he considered a friend. But when detectives explained the evidence they had already gathered and the seriousness of the charges Evan was facing, Kyle's resistance crumbled. He admitted that Evan had complained about his mother constantly, that he had talked about her as if she were an obstacle rather than a person, and that he had once said something along the lines of, "If she would just let me handle things or get out of the way, my life would be so much easier." Kyle insisted he had not taken the comment seriously at the time, that he had assumed Evan was just venting the way people do when they are frustrated. But looking back, Kyle said, there had been a coldness in the way Evan talked about Diane, a lack of empathy that should have been a warning sign. Rachel recounted one particularly telling incident that had happened about a month before Diane's death. Evan had come home late one evening and found that Diane had locked the deadbolt from the inside, something she did every night for safety. He had pounded on the door, waking her up, and then berated her for making him wait. Diane had apologized, even though she had done nothing wrong, and Evan had stormed past her without another word. Rachel had heard about the incident the next day when Diane called her in tears, saying she did not know how much longer she could live like this. Rachel had begged her mother to kick Evan out, to change the locks, to do something to protect herself. But Diane had said she could not do that to her own son. Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper when she told the detectives, she died protecting him, and he killed her anyway. That statement would stay with the investigative team long after the interview ended. By the time detectives finished canvassing Diane's social circle, they had dozens of witness statements that all pointed to the same conclusion. Evan Mercer had been a parasite in his mother's life, draining her resources, disrespecting her boundaries, and growing increasingly hostile as she began to assert control. Diane had been planning to cut him off, and he had known it. The appointment on Monday was not just a meeting with a lawyer. It was a deadline. After that appointment, Evan's access to money, housing, and the safety net his mother provided would have been gone. He could not allow that to happen. So he made sure Diane never made it to Monday. The witnesses had spoken. The pattern was clear. And the motive that had seemed abstract at the start of the investigation was now concrete, documented, and impossible to ignore. Evan Mercer had killed his mother to protect his own comfort, and the people who had known them both were ready to say so under oath. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon when a digital forensics specialist named Marcus Chen logged into the cloud storage account linked to Diane Mercer's home security system. Rachel had provided the login credentials during an earlier interview, and investigators had been moving carefully through the legal process required to access and preserve the footage. Marcus had worked hundreds of cases involving digital evidence, but even he felt a knot in his stomach as the account loaded. He knew what he was looking for. The question was whether it still existed. Our Evan had unplugged the cameras hours after the murder, and there was always a chance that the footage had failed to upload, or had been corrupted, or had somehow been deleted before it reached the cloud. But as the file directory populated on his screen, Marcus saw exactly what the prosecution needed. Motion-triggered clips from the night Diane died, time-stamped and intact, waiting to tell the story Evan thought he had erased. The first clip was brief, only 14 seconds long, recorded at 11:48, the night before Diane's death. It showed the hallway outside her bedroom, dimly lit by the small nightlight plugged into the wall. The timestamp glowed in the corner. For the first few seconds, nothing moved. Then Diane's bedroom door opened slowly, and a figure appeared in the frame. It was Diane herself, moving carefully, one hand on the doorframe for balance, her oxygen tubing trailing behind her. She paused, looked down the hallway as if listening for something, and then stepped back into her room and closed the door. The clip ended. It was mundane, innocent, the kind of footage that would normally be ignored. But it mattered because it established that Diane had been alive, mobile, and functioning normally less than 3 hours before Evan claimed to have found her unresponsive. It also showed that the camera had been working perfectly that night, capturing and uploading exactly as it was designed to do. The second clip started at 2:11 in the morning. Marcus leaned closer to the screen as the video began. The hallway was darker now, the house silent and still. Then movement entered the frame from the left side. Evan Mercer, dressed in a t-shirt and sweatpants, walking slowly down the hallway with something held under his right arm. The object was light-colored and rectangular. A pillow. Marcus paused the video and zoomed in slightly, making sure the image was as clear as possible. Evan's face was visible, his expression difficult to read, but unmistakably alert. This was not a man stumbling half asleep toward the bathroom. This was someone moving with purpose. Marcus resumed the playback. Evan stopped outside Diane's door and stood there for what felt like a long time, but was actually only 18 seconds according to the timestamp. He shifted his weight. He glanced back down the hallway, not quite looking at the camera, but close enough that his profile was captured clearly. Then he reached for the door handle, opened it, and stepped inside. The camera could not see into Diane's room, but the audio channel remained active. Marcus turned up the volume on his computer and listened. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then came a faint rustling sound, followed by a voice. Diane's voice, startled and confused, asking, "What are you doing?" The words were quiet but clear enough to be understood. Then came other sounds. Movement, a muffled gasp, the creak of a bed frame shifting, a scraping noise like something being dragged across wood. The sounds were brief, lasting less than a minute, but their implication was unmistakable. Someone was struggling, someone was being overpowered. And then, gradually, the sound stopped. Silence filled the audio track, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. Marcus sat very still. He was staring at the frozen image of Diane's partially open door. He had worked enough homicide cases to know what he was hearing. This was not a medical emergency. This was murder. The third clip began at 2:17, just 6 minutes after the previous one ended. Evan emerged from Diane's room, his breathing audible and heavier than before. His sleeves were pushed up, revealing his forearms, and even in the grainy black and white footage, a dark mark was visible on his right arm. He paused in the hallway, wiped his hands on his shirt, and looked down at himself as if checking for something. Then he walked toward the camera. His face filled more of the frame now, his expression blank and focused. He reached up with one hand, and the image jerked slightly as he grabbed the camera. For a moment, his fingers were visible in the foreground, and then the screen went black. The feed had been cut. Evan had unplugged the device, believing that disconnecting it would erase what it had just recorded. He did not know that every clip had already been uploaded wirelessly to a server the moment it was captured. He did not know that the cloud does not forget. He thought he had been smart. He thought he had covered his tracks. He had been wrong. Marcus backed up the footage and watched all 3 clips again, this time taking detailed notes on timestamps, visual details, and audio markers. He noted the pillow. He noted the pause outside the door. He noted the audio of Diane's voice and the struggle that followed. He noted the mark on Evan's arm and the deliberate way he reached for the camera afterward. Every detail mattered. Every frame was potential evidence. When he finished his review, Marcus exported the clips into multiple formats, created redundant backups, and documented the entire chain of custody to ensure the footage would be admissible in court. Then he called the lead detective and said 5 words that would change the trajectory of the case. "We have it. All of it." The prosecution team gathered in a conference room the following day to review the footage. The lead prosecutor, a woman named Catherine Morales, watched in silence as the clips played on the large monitor mounted on the wall. She had been preparing for trial based on autopsy results, phone data, and witness testimony, all of which painted a strong circumstantial case. But this footage was different. This was direct evidence. This was the crime being committed in real time. It captured by a device the killer had forgotten existed until it was too late. When the final clip ended and the screen went dark, Catherine sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly. She turned to the detective sitting across from her and said, "We just went from strong to unbeatable." The detective nodded. They both knew what this footage meant. There would be no plea deal, no argument about reasonable doubt, no defense strategy that could explain away what the jury was about to see. Evan Mercer had recorded his own conviction. Rachel was shown edited portions of the footage during a meeting with prosecutors a few days later. They did not show her everything. They spared her the audio of her mother's voice and the worst of the struggle. But they showed her enough. Evan walking down the hallway with the pillow, entering the room, be emerging minutes later and unplugging the camera. Rachel watched without speaking, her hands clenched in her lap, her face pale. When the screen went dark, she closed her eyes and took several slow breaths. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Catherine. "I want him to see this played in court," Rachel said quietly. "I want him to sit there and watch what he did, and I want the jury to see his face when he realizes he is not getting away with it." Catherine nodded. "He will," she promised, "and so will everyone else." The arrest warrant was issued the same week. Detectives drove to the Mercer house early in the morning, the same time of day Evan had supposedly been asleep when his mother died. He answered the door in pajamas again, his hair messy, his expression annoyed, until he saw the handcuffs. The lead detective read him his rights in a calm, measured voice and explained that he was being charged with aggravated murder, and tampering with evidence. Evan's face went through a series of reactions: confusion, anger, disbelief, and finally something that looked like fear. He asked what evidence they had. The detective did not answer directly. He simply said, "The camera remembered what you tried to forget." Evan went silent. His lawyer would explain the details to him later, but in that moment, standing in the doorway of the house where he had killed his mother, Evan understood that the lie he had been living was over. Metal cuffs closed around his wrists. The click echoed in the quiet morning air. And as he was led toward the patrol car, a technician inside the house photographed the hallway one more time. Out of the small square outline on the wall where the camera had been mounted, still visible, like a ghost that refused to leave. Understanding Evan Mercer did not require sympathy, but it required honesty. He was not a monster born fully formed. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding responsibility, blaming others for his failures, and believing that the world owed him comfort without effort. That mindset had been shaped over years by a combination of poor choices, enabling relationships, and a fundamental inability to see other people as anything more than resources to be used. Psychologists who reviewed his background for the prosecution found a pattern common among family annihilators and financial killers: entitlement so deep it had replaced empathy. But Evan had not killed his mother in a moment of uncontrollable rage or mental breakdown. He had killed her because she was about to stop being useful to him, and he could not tolerate that loss of control. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of cold calculation, dressed up in the language of inevitability. Evan's history revealed a man who had never learned to manage disappointment. He had dropped out of college after 2 semesters, blaming the professors for being unfair and the coursework for being irrelevant. He had cycled through jobs that never lasted more than a few months, each one ending with him claiming he had been mistreated or underappreciated. Relationships followed the same pattern. He dated women who eventually left him, and each time he described himself as the victim of someone else's selfishness. The common thread in every failure was his refusal to take responsibility. Evan existed in a world where problems were always someone else's fault, where his struggles were always the result of bad luck or sabotage, and where the idea that he might need to change never seemed to occur to him. Diane had enabled that mindset for years by absorbing his failures and shielding him from consequences, and by the time she tried to stop, it was too late. The family dynamic had been broken long before Diane's death. Rachel described growing up in a household where Evan had always been treated differently. He was the younger child, the one Diane worried about, the one who needed more attention and more chances. Rachel had learned early to be independent because her mother's energy was always focused on managing Evan. That imbalance had created resentment, but it had also given Rachel clarity. She saw her brother for what he was, a manipulator who used their mother's love as a weapon. Diane, on the other hand, had never been able to see it. She had interpreted Evan's failures as proof that he needed her more, not proof that she was enabling his dysfunction. That misplaced compassion had kept Evan dependent and Diane trapped in a cycle where every boundary she tried to set was met with guilt, anger, or threats of self-destruction. It was emotional hostage-taking, and it had been going on for decades. Prosecutors and behavioral analysts who studied the case noted that Evan's psychology fit a specific profile. He exhibited narcissistic traits combined with antisocial tendencies. He lacked genuine remorse and had a limited capacity for empathy. For he viewed relationships transactionally, measuring people by what they could provide rather than by any intrinsic value. Diane had been useful as a source of money, housing, and emotional labor. When she stopped being useful, or more accurately, when she threatened to stop, Evan saw her as an obstacle rather than a person. That cognitive distortion allowed him to rationalize murder as a solution rather than recognizing it as the ultimate betrayal. Experts would later testify that people like Evan do not kill out of mental illness or diminished capacity. They kill because they have decided that their own needs matter more than someone else's life, and they believe they are smart enough to get away with it. Jail calls recorded after Evans' arrest provided chilling insight into his mindset. He called a friend within the first week and spent most of the conversation complaining about the conditions in jail, the quality of the food, and the incompetence of his public defender. He mentioned his mother only once, and it was to express frustration that people are acting like she was some kind of saint when she was making my life impossible. There was no grief in his voice, no guilt, no recognition that he had taken a life. He spoke about Diane as if she had been an antagonist in his story, rather than the woman who had given him everything and received murder in return. When the friend, clearly uncomfortable, suggested that maybe Evan should focus on showing remorse, Evan snapped that he had nothing to be sorry for because his mother was already dying anyway. That statement, recorded and transcribed, he would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence at trial. In another call, this time to a distant relative who had agreed to accept the charges, Evan insisted that the case against him was entirely circumstantial. He said the prosecutors were twisting innocent actions into evidence of guilt, that the camera footage proved nothing, and that any halfway decent jury would see through the lies. He expressed confidence that he would be acquitted because, in his words, "You cannot convict someone for the death of a woman who was already on her way out." That phrase, cold and dismissive, revealed how Evan had rationalized the murder. He genuinely believed that Diane's illness gave him moral cover, that killing a sick person was somehow less criminal than killing a healthy one. He did not understand, or refuse to accept, that the law does not recognize degrees of victimhood based on pre-existing conditions. Murder is murder, and vulnerability does not make a victim less worthy of justice. It makes the crime worse. The psychological assessment ordered by the court found Evan competent to stand trial and fully aware of the wrongfulness of his actions. He did not suffer from delusions or psychosis. He understood right from wrong. He simply believed the rules did not apply to him. The evaluating psychologist noted that Evan displayed a striking lack of insight into his own behavior and an inability to perspective take, meaning he could not or would not consider how his actions affected others. When asked during the evaluation how he thought his sister felt about their mother's death, Evan shrugged and said Rachel had always been dramatic and was probably using the situation for attention. When asked if he missed his mother, he paused and then said he missed not having to worry about rent. The psychologist documented those responses without comment, but the implications were clear. Evan Mercer had no emotional connection to the woman he killed. She had been a means to an end, and when that arrangement was threatened, he eliminated her. The prosecution would use all of this psychological evidence to argue that Evan was not a man who had snapped under pressure or acted out of desperation. He was a man who had carefully weighed his options and chosen murder because it solved his immediate problem. The deleted search history proved he had researched the act. The financial records proved he had a motive. And the timeline proved he had planned it. The camera footage proved he had done it. And the jail calls proved he felt no remorse. Taken together, the evidence painted a picture of someone dangerous not because he was irrational, but because he was coldly rational. He had looked at his sick, vulnerable mother and decided her life was worth less than his comfort. That decision had not been made in a moment of rage. It had been made over weeks of resentment, entitlement, and the gradual erosion of whatever humanity he might have once possessed. He had killed Diane Mercer not because he hated her, but because he saw her as an inconvenience. And in the moral calculus of Evan's world, inconveniences were meant to be removed. The trial began on a cold morning in late February, nearly 5 months after Diane Mercer's death. The courthouse was older, built in an era when justice was meant to feel weighty and solemn, with high ceilings, wood paneling, and rows of benches that creaked under the weight of spectators. The gallery filled early, a mix of family members, reporters, and members of the public who had followed the case through local news and online coverage. Rachel sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face composed, but her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. She had waited months for this day, months of living in the house where her mother had been killed, months of fielding questions from investigators and journalists, months of carrying a grief so heavy it felt like physical weight. Now, finally, the man who had taken everything from her would have to answer for it. Now, Evan entered the courtroom through a side door, flanked by 2 deputies and dressed in a suit that looked borrowed or hastily purchased. It was too big in the shoulders and too short in the sleeves, giving him the appearance of someone playing dress-up rather than someone facing life in prison. But it was not the ill-fitting suit that drew attention. It was his demeanor. He walked in casually, scanning the gallery as if taking inventory, his expression somewhere between bored and amused. When his eyes landed on Rachel, he did not look away or show any sign of shame. He just stared at her for a moment, blank and unreadable, and then turned his attention to his attorney. Rachel felt her stomach twist. She had expected anger or fear or even fake remorse. She had not expected indifference. It was as if Evan believed the entire proceeding was beneath him, a formality he would endure before returning to his life as if nothing had changed. The judge entered, and the room rose in unison. Judge Harold Brennan was in his early 60s, a former prosecutor known for running a tight courtroom and having little patience for theatrics. He had presided over dozens of murder trials and had developed an instinct for reading defendants. As he took his seat and looked down at Evan, his expression remained neutral, but those who knew him well could see the faint tightening around his eyes. Brennan had read the case file. He had seen the evidence. And he had already formed an opinion about the man sitting at the defense table, though he would never let that opinion interfere with his responsibility to ensure a fair trial. He gavelled the session to order and instructed the bailiff to bring in the jury. 12 citizens who had been selected after days of questioning filed into the jury box, their faces serious and focused. They had been told this was a murder case, but they did not yet know the details. That would come soon enough. The defense strategy became clear during opening statements. Evan's attorney, a public defender named Marcus Gill, stood and addressed the jury with the calm confidence of someone who understood his job was nearly impossible, but had to try anyway. He acknowledged that Diane Mercer had died and that her death was tragic. He acknowledged that Evan had been living in her home and that there had been tension in the household. But he argued that tension did not equal murder, that Diane's medical condition had made her vulnerable to sudden decline, and that the prosecution's case was built on coincidence and circumstantial evidence rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He reminded the jury that they would see and hear things designed to provoke emotion, but that their job was to follow the law and only convict if the evidence met the highest standard. He did not claim Evan was innocent. He simply argued that the state had not proven guilt. It was a defensive strategy, the kind used when the facts are bad and the goal is to create just enough doubt to hang a jury. Catherine Morales, the lead prosecutor, delivered the opening statement for the state. She stood in front of the jury box and spoke in a calm, measured voice that carried the weight of absolute certainty. She told them that over the coming days they would hear about a mother who had given everything to a son who gave nothing in return. They would hear about financial abuse, manipulation, and a household where one person took and took until there was nothing left to take. She told them about the appointment Diane had scheduled, the appointment that would have changed Evan's access to money and housing, the appointment he made sure she never attended. She told them about the search history, the deleted queries, the questions about smothering and detection, and whether sick people's deaths were investigated closely. She told them about the camera footage, about the pillow, about the audio of Diane's voice, and the struggle that followed. And she told them that at the end of the trial, the evidence would leave them with only one conclusion. Evan Mercer had murdered his mother in cold blood, staged the scene to look natural, and spent months lying about it until technology exposed the truth he thought he had erased. The courtroom was silent when Catherine finished. She returned to her seat, and the judge instructed the prosecution to call its first witness. The trial had officially begun, and the careful process of dismantling Evan's lies was underway. Over the following days, the prosecution built its case brick by brick. First responders testified about the delayed 911 call and the staged bedroom. The medical examiner took the stand and walked the jury through the autopsy findings, using diagrams and photographs to explain why Diane's death could not have been natural. Neighbors testified about arguments and tension. Rachel testified about her mother's plans to change her financial arrangements and the fear Diane had expressed in her final days. Each witness added another layer of proof, and with each layer, Evan's defense became thinner. The jury watched Evan throughout the testimony. Some looked for signs of remorse or grief. Others watched to see how he reacted to evidence that contradicted his story. What they saw was a man who appeared detached, occasionally whispering to his attorney, but mostly sitting with his arms crossed, his face expressionless. When Rachel took the stand and broke down while describing the last text message her mother had sent, Evan looked down at the table in front of him, not out of shame, but out of what seemed like irritation. When the medical examiner described the bruising inside Diane's mouth and the evidence of smothering, Evan shook his head slightly, as if disagreeing with an opinion rather than confronting proof of his own violence. The jurors noticed. They noticed everything. And with each passing day, the narrative Evan had tried to build crumbled a little more. Public reaction outside the courtroom grew as the trial progressed. Local news outlets covered the proceedings daily, and the details were picked up by national true crime shows and online forums. People were outraged not just by the crime itself, but by Evan's behavior, his lack of emotion, his apparent belief that he would be acquitted, his treatment of his mother's death as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. Social media filled with discussions about family violence, financial abuse, and the way society often overlooks elder abuse until it is too late. Diane's story resonated with people who had their own experiences with manipulative family members, with adult children who refused to grow up, with the exhausting cycle of enabling and excusing until something breaks. The case became more than a murder trial. It became a conversation about accountability, about the limits of forgiveness, and about what happens when love is mistaken for permission. The prosecution approached the end of its case. They had presented the autopsy, the phone records, the witness testimony, and the financial motive. Everything pointed toward guilt. But they had saved the most powerful evidence for last. Catherine stood and told the judge that the state was ready to introduce Exhibit 42. But a large monitor was wheeled into the courtroom and positioned so the jury, the judge, and the gallery could all see it clearly. The lights were dimmed slightly. Evan, who had been leaning back in his chair, sat up straighter. His attorney placed a hand on his forearm, a gesture that seemed more like a warning than reassurance. Catherine pressed a button on the laptop in front of her, and the screen brightened. A timestamp appeared in the corner. The hallway outside Diane's bedroom filled the frame, and for the first time since the trial began, Evan Mercer's expression changed. The casual confidence disappeared. The smirk that had carried him through weeks of testimony vanished, and in its place was something the jury had not seen before. The face of a man who finally understood that his lies had run out of places to hide. The first day of testimony had established the foundation. Now the prosecution's job was to build a wall of evidence so complete, so interlocking, that the defense would have nowhere to go. Catherine Morales approached each witness methodically, extracting testimony that was clear, factual, and devastating. She did not rush. She did not rely on drama. She let the evidence speak for itself, knowing that jurors respond better to calm professionalism than to theatrical flourishes. The cumulative effect was exactly what she intended, a case that felt less like an argument and more like an inevitable conclusion. Evan Mercer had killed his mother, and every piece of evidence from every direction pointed to that singular truth. The first responders returned to the stand to provide additional detail. The lead paramedic explained that when he arrived at the scene, Evan had not been performing CPR or showing any urgency. He had been standing in the hallway, calm and composed, as if he had already accepted what had happened. The paramedic described entering Diane's bedroom and immediately noticing inconsistencies. The pillow on the floor instead of under her head, the oxygen tubing looped awkwardly, the blankets arranged too neatly for someone who had died in distress. He testified that in his years of responding to medical emergencies, he had seen countless natural deaths, and this one did not fit the pattern. Defense attorney Marcus Gill cross-examined aggressively, suggesting that the paramedic was not a trained investigator and that his suspicions were subjective rather than scientific. But the paramedic held firm. He said he knew what a natural death looked like, and this was not it. Dr. Laura Hines, the medical examiner, took the stand for a second time to address questions the defense had raised about Diane's pre-existing conditions. Catherine guided her through a detailed explanation of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and why, despite its severity, it had not killed Diane that night. Dr. Hines used diagrams projected onto the courtroom screen to show the jury what healthy lung tissue looked like compared to Diane's damaged lungs. She acknowledged that Diane's respiratory system was compromised and that her lifespan was likely shortened by her illness. But she was unequivocal in her conclusion. The cause of death was not disease. It was asphyxiation. She pointed to the petechial hemorrhages, the bruising inside the mouth, and the soft tissue damage, all of which were inconsistent with a natural respiratory decline. She explained that if Diane had died from her lung disease, the pattern of injury would have been entirely different. There would have been no bruising, no hemorrhaging, no signs of struggle. The science was clear, and Dr. Hines delivered it with the kind of authority that left little room for doubt. On cross-examination, Marcus Gill tried to suggest that the injuries could have been caused by attempts at resuscitation or by Diane moving in her sleep. Dr. Hines shut that down immediately. She explained that the injuries were fresh, occurring at or near the time of death, and that they were concentrated in areas consistent with smothering rather than self-inflicted trauma. She also noted that no resuscitation had been attempted, according to both Evan's own statements and the paramedics' observations. Gill pressed her on whether it was possible, even unlikely, that the injuries had another explanation. Dr. Hines paused, looked directly at the jury, and said, "In my professional opinion, based on 30 years of forensic pathology, there is no reasonable explanation for these injuries other than homicidal asphyxiation." The courtroom was silent. Gill had no follow-up. He sat down, and Dr. Hines was excused. The digital forensics analyst, Marcus Chen, took the stand next. He walked the jury through the process of extracting data from Evan's phone and explaining in simple terms how modern devices store information even after a user believes it has been deleted. He displayed screenshots of Evan's search history on the courtroom monitor, each query appearing one by one as he read them aloud. Can someone with lung disease die suddenly in their sleep? How long does it take for security cameras to delete footage? Can smothering be detected in an autopsy? Each search was time-stamped, and each one had been entered in the 2 weeks leading up to Diane's death. The jury leaned forward, some of them taking notes, others simply staring at the screen in disbelief. Marcus explained that the searches had been deleted within minutes of being entered, but that the phone's operating system and the search engine servers had retained logs. He concluded by saying that in his professional experience, this pattern of searches indicated premeditation and planning, not curiosity or coincidence. Catherine then introduced the financial evidence. A forensic accountant took the stand and walked the jury through Diane's bank records and Evan's transaction history. She showed withdrawals from Diane's account that corresponded with deposits into Evan's. She showed charges on Diane's credit card for things Evan had purchased. She showed the overdrafts in Evan's personal account and the mounting debt he had accumulated over the previous year. Then she showed the most damaging piece, the attempted transfer at 4:15 in the morning, 2 hours after Diane had been killed and more than 2 hours before Evan called 911. The accountant explained that the transaction had been flagged as suspicious by the bank's fraud detection system and blocked, but the attempt itself had been logged. She testified that in her opinion, this was not the behavior of a grieving son. It was the behavior of someone securing assets before reporting a death. Rachel took the stand again, this time to provide context about her mother's plans. She testified about the appointment Diane had scheduled with her attorney, the conversations they had about removing Evan from her accounts, and the text message Diane had sent the night she died. Catherine asked Rachel to read the text aloud. Rachel's voice shook as she said, "He's angry. Call me in the morning." Catherine asked what Rachel thought her mother meant. Rachel looked directly at the jury and said, "She meant she was scared. She meant she needed help. And I did not get there in time." The courtroom was silent. Several jurors looked down at their hands. Evan stared at the table in front of him, his jaw tight. Rachel was excused, and as she walked past the defense table, she did not look at her brother. He did not look at her either. Diane's attorney, Margaret Feldman, testified about the consultation Diane had scheduled and the specific changes she intended to make. She confirmed that Diane had planned to remove Evan as a beneficiary, restrict his access to her bank accounts, and establish a trust to protect her assets. She testified that Diane had sounded stressed during their phone call, but resolute, as if she had finally made a decision she had been avoiding for years. Margaret said that in her experience, our clients who scheduled those kinds of appointments were often responding to a crisis or a breaking point. She added that Diane had specifically mentioned there would be conflict, meaning she anticipated resistance from Evan. That testimony tied the motive directly to the timeline. Diane was set to cut him off on Monday. She was killed early Sunday morning. The timing was not coincidental. It was causal. The defense called only a handful of witnesses, and none of them contradicted the core facts of the case. Marcus Gill tried to introduce testimony from a psychologist who suggested that Evan's lack of visible emotion could be explained by shock or a personality disorder rather than guilt. But on cross-examination, McCatherine got the psychologist to admit that people with personality disorders are still capable of understanding right from wrong and are still held legally accountable for their actions. Jill also called a neighbor who testified that Diane had seemed frail in the months before her death. But Catherine pointed out on cross that frailty does not equal terminal decline and that the medical examiner had already established the cause of death. The defense rested after less than 2 days of testimony. They had nothing that could overcome the wall the prosecution had built. Every category of evidence pointed toward guilt. Every witness had reinforced the narrative. And the video footage, which still had not been shown to the jury, was waiting. Catherine stood and told the judge that the state had one final piece of evidence to present. The courtroom, which had been filled with murmurs and shifting bodies, went completely still. The large monitor was repositioned. The lights dimmed. Evan's attorney leaned close and whispered something to him. Evan shook his head slightly, his face pale now, the casual confidence that had carried him through the trial completely gone. The jurors sat forward in their seats. Rachel gripped the edge of the bench in front of her, and Catherine Morales, standing beside the monitor with a remote in her hand, pressed play. The timestamp appeared. The hallway filled the screen. and the jury, for the first time, saw exactly what Evan Mercer had done to the woman who had loved him more than he ever deserved. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete that the faint hum of the projector became the only sound. Our Catherine Morales stood to the side of the monitor, her hand resting lightly on the table beside her, her eyes on the jury rather than the screen. She had watched this footage dozens of times during trial preparation, had studied every frame and every second, but she knew that for the 12 people in the jury box, this would be the first time. And she knew that what they were about to see would stay with them long after the trial ended. The timestamp glowed in the corner of the screen. November 7th, 11:48 at night. The hallway was dim, lit only by the small nightlight near the floor. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then Diane's bedroom door opened, and a figure appeared. It was Diane herself, moving slowly, one hand braced against the doorframe, her oxygen tubing trailing behind her. She paused. I looked down the hallway as if listening, and then stepped back inside and closed the door. The clip ended. The jury had just seen Diane Mercer alive, functioning, and completely unaware that she had less than 3 hours left to live. Catherine let the silence hold for a moment before speaking. She told the jury that the clip they had just seen established 2 critical facts. Diane had been alive and mobile late that evening, and the camera system had been working perfectly. She explained that the next clip they would see had been recorded 2.5 hours later, and that it would show the defendant, Evan Mercer, moving through the same hallway. She reminded them that Evan had claimed during his 911 call that he had been asleep all night and had only woken up at 4:30 to check on his mother. She told them to watch carefully and to remember that the footage they were about to see had been uploaded automatically to the cloud, preserved despite Evan's attempt to erase it. Then she pressed play again. The timestamp changed. November 8th, 2:11 in the morning. The hallway was darker now, the house deep in the stillness that comes in the hours before dawn. Then movement entered the frame from the left. Evan Mercer appeared on screen, walking slowly down the hallway. He was dressed in a t-shirt and sweatpants, and under his right arm he carried something light-colored and rectangular. A pillow. The jury leaned forward almost in unison. Several of them glanced quickly at Evan sitting at the defense table before returning their eyes to the screen. On the monitor, Evan moved with deliberate purpose. Not the uncertain stumbling of someone half asleep, but the focused movement of someone executing a plan. He stopped outside Diane's bedroom door and stood there. The timestamp continued ticking forward. 18 seconds passed. He shifted his weight. He glanced back down the hallway, his face partially visible in the dim light. His expression was hard to read, but there was no confusion in his posture, no hesitation that suggested he did not know what he was about to do. Then he reached for the door handle, turned it slowly, and stepped inside. The door closed most of the way, leaving just a narrow gap. The hallway was empty again, but the audio channel remained active. Catherine had warned the jury during her opening statement that they would hear audio from inside Diane's room. Now that audio filled the courtroom through speakers positioned near the monitor. At first there was only silence, the faint background hum of the oxygen machine. Then came a rustling sound, followed by Diane's voice. It was quiet, startled, confused. "What are you doing?" The words were clear enough that several jurors flinched. Then came other sounds, movement, a muffled gasp, the creak of the bed frame, a scraping noise like something being dragged or pressed against wood. The sounds were brief, less than a minute, but they painted a vivid and horrible picture. Someone was struggling. Someone was being overpowered. And then, gradually, the sound stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the struggle that had preceded it. It was the silence of something ending. The jury sat frozen. One woman in the back row had her hand pressed to her mouth. A man in the front row stared at the screen with his jaw clenched. Rachel, sitting behind the prosecution table, closed her eyes and let the tears she had been holding back finally fall. The third clip began automatically. The timestamp read 2:17, just 6 minutes after Evan had entered the room. The door opened and Evan emerged. His breathing was audible now, heavier than before. His sleeves were pushed up, and even in the grainy black-and-white footage, a dark mark was visible on his right forearm. He paused in the hallway and looked down at himself, adjusting his shirt, wiping his hands against his pants. Then he walked toward the camera. His face filled more of the frame, his expression blank and unreadable. He reached up with one hand, his fingers extending toward the lens, and then the image jerked. The screen went black. He had unplugged the device, severing the feed. But it was too late. Everything he had done had already been captured and uploaded to a server he did not know existed. The courtroom lights came up slightly, and Catherine turned off the monitor. The screen went dark, but the weight of what had just been shown remained. Catherine walked slowly back to the jury box. She did not need to explain what they had just seen. The footage spoke for itself, but she wanted to make sure they understood the significance. She reminded them that Evan had claimed to be asleep during the time the video was recorded. She reminded them that he had claimed not to have entered his mother's room until 4:30 in the morning, when he supposedly found her unresponsive. She reminded them that he had told the 911 dispatcher and the responding officers that he had heard nothing unusual during the night. Every one of those statements, she said, was a lie. The video proved it, the audio proved it, the timeline proved it. Evan Mercer had walked into his mother's room in the middle of the night, carrying a pillow, and when he came out, Diane Mercer was dead. He had not called for help. He had not tried to save her. He had unplugged the camera, staged the scene, and waited hours before calling 911 so the timeline would support his story. Catherine paused and looked directly at the jury. "That," she said quietly, "is not grief. That is guilt." The defense had no rebuttal that could overcome what the jury had just witnessed. Marcus Gill stood during cross-examination of the digital analyst and tried to suggest that the video was incomplete, that it did not show what happened inside the room, that the audio could be interpreted in different ways. But his arguments felt hollow. The jury had seen Evan enter with a pillow. They had heard Diane's voice and the struggle. They had seen him emerge minutes later and immediately disable the camera. There was no innocent explanation. Gill argued that the video did not prove intent, that it was possible Evan had been trying to help his mother in some misguided way, and that things had gone wrong. But even as he said the words, his tone lacked conviction. He knew, and the jury knew, that the footage had destroyed any remaining doubt. When Gill sat down, several jurors were still staring at the defense table, their faces reflecting a mix of anger and disbelief. Evan himself had changed. The casual arrogance that had defined his demeanor throughout the trial was gone. His face was pale, his hands clenched together on the table in front of him, his shoulders hunched slightly, as if trying to make himself smaller. For the first time since the trial began, he looked like a man who understood that he was not getting away with this. He whispered something to his attorney, but Gill shook his head and did not respond. Evan looked toward the gallery, briefly meeting Rachel's eyes. She stared back at him with an expression that held no forgiveness, no sympathy, only the cold clarity of someone who had spent months waiting for this moment. Evan looked away first. He had nothing left to hide behind. The video had stripped away every excuse, every lie, every carefully constructed narrative. The jury had seen the truth, and the truth was unforgiving. Catherine rested the state's case shortly after the video was played. There was nothing left to prove. The prosecution had shown motive through financial records and witness testimony. They had shown planning through the phone's search history. They had shown the act itself through the camera footage. They had shown consciousness of guilt through the staging, the delayed call, and the attempt to transfer money before reporting the death. Every element of the crime had been documented, time-stamped, and presented in a way that left no room for reasonable doubt. The defense had no witnesses who could refute the science, no experts who could explain away the video, and no narrative that could transform murder into anything less than what it was. The case was over in every meaningful sense. All that remained was for the jury to say so officially. The judge called for a recess before closing arguments, and as the courtroom emptied, people spoke in hushed tones about what they had just seen. Some were angry, some were heartbroken, but all of them understood that they had just witnessed the moment Evan Mercer's lies had finally met the evidence he could not erase. The video had played, and the truth, preserved in the cloud and undeniable in its clarity, had spoken louder than any defense attorney ever could. Closing arguments began the following morning. The courtroom was packed, every seat in the gallery filled with family members, reporters, and members of the public who had followed the case from the beginning. The air felt heavy with anticipation, the kind that settles over a room when everyone knows the outcome is inevitable, but the ritual must still be completed. Marcus Gill rose first to deliver the defense's closing argument, his face showing the strain of defending a case that had been lost the moment the video played. He stood before the jury and acknowledged the difficulty of what he was about to ask them. He reminded them that their job was not to decide whether Diane Mercer's death was tragic, because it clearly was. Their job was to decide whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Evan Mercer had intentionally murdered his mother. He argued that doubt still existed, that the video did not show the act itself, only moments before and after, and that it was possible Evan had gone to check on his mother, and things had gone tragically wrong in ways the footage could not capture. Gill's argument felt weak even as he delivered it. He tried to suggest that Diane's fragile health meant she could have died from a combination of stress, panic, and respiratory failure during a moment of confusion. He tried to frame the delayed 911 call as shock rather than calculation. He tried to characterize the search history as morbid curiosity rather than premeditation. But every point he made was immediately undermined by the evidence the jury had already seen. His voice lacked the conviction that might have planted seeds of doubt, and several jurors watched him with expressions that suggested they had already made up their minds. McGill concluded by reminding the jury that the burden of proof rested entirely on the prosecution, that they could not convict based on suspicion or emotion, and that if they had any reasonable doubt, they were obligated to find Evan not guilty. He sat down. The courtroom remained silent. No one seemed convinced. Catherine Morales stood and took her place in front of the jury. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She spoke with the calm authority of someone who knew the facts were on her side and that the jury had already seen everything they needed to see. She began by thanking the jurors for their time and attention, acknowledging that what they had witnessed over the past 2 weeks had been difficult and disturbing. Then she walked them through the case one final time, not to overwhelm them, but to show how every piece of evidence fit together into a single, undeniable narrative. She reminded them of Diane's appointment on Monday, the appointment that would have removed Evan's access to money and housing. She reminded them of the search history, the questions about smothering and detection that Evan had typed into his phone in the days before his mother died. She reminded them of the financial desperation, the overdrafts, the debt, and the attempted transfer at 4 a.m. while Diane's body was still warm. Then Catherine turned to the video. She told the jury that in her years as a prosecutor, she had handled cases that relied on circumstantial evidence, cases where guilt had to be inferred from patterns and behavior. But this was not one of those cases, and this case had given them something rare and unambiguous, direct evidence of the crime being committed. They had seen Evan walk down the hallway with a pillow in his hand. They had heard Diane's voice, startled and confused, asking what he was doing. They had heard the sounds of struggle. They had seen him emerge minutes later and immediately disable the camera. Catherine paused and let that sequence settle over the jury. Then she said, "That is not a man checking on his sick mother. That is a man who just committed murder and is trying to cover it up." She reminded them that Evan had not called for help. He had not performed CPR. He had not shown any urgency. Instead, he had waited hours, staged the scene, and told lie after lie to make it look like Diane had died peacefully in her sleep. Catherine addressed the defense's argument directly. She said that Marcus Gill had asked them to imagine scenarios where the evidence could be interpreted differently, where doubt could be manufactured out of possibility. But she reminded them that reasonable doubt is not the same as imaginary doubt. Reasonable doubt must be based on reason, on logic, on evidence that actually exists. And there was no evidence that supported innocence. Every fact, every witness, every recording pointed in one direction. Evan Mercer had murdered his mother to protect his access to her money and her home, and he had done it in the most cowardly way possible, by targeting a woman too weak to fight back. Catherine's voice remained steady, but the moral weight of her words was unmistakable. She told the jury that Diane Mercer had spent her final moments terrified, struggling to breathe, betrayed by the person she had loved and protected for years. And she told them that their verdict would be the only justice Diane would ever receive. Catherine concluded by walking back to the prosecution table and standing beside Rachel. She gestured toward the empty space in the gallery where Diane should have been sitting. She said, "Diane Mercer is not here to tell you what happened that night, but the evidence is, the camera is, the science is, and all of it is telling you the same thing. Evan Mercer is guilty, not probably guilty, not possibly guilty, guilty beyond any reasonable doubt." She thanked the jury again and sat down. The courtroom was silent. Several jurors were nodding slightly. One woman wiped her eyes. The moral clarity of the case had been laid bare, and there was nothing left to argue. The judge gave the jury their instructions, explaining the charges and the legal standards they were required to apply. He reminded them that sympathy and emotion could not replace evidence, but that evidence, when overwhelming and consistent, must be given its proper weight. He told them that video, autopsy results, phone records, and witness testimony were all forms of evidence they were entitled to consider together, not in isolation. The jury was escorted out of the courtroom to begin deliberations. The wait began. Rachel sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with family members who had come to support her. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say. The evidence had been presented. The arguments had been made. Now the decision rested with 12 strangers who held Evan's future in their hands. Hours passed. Lunch was brought in. Afternoon turned to early evening. Then, just after 5 o'clock, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The speed surprised no one. In cases where the evidence is this clear, deliberations are often quick. The jury does not need days to debate what the video has already shown them. They only need time to review the charges, discuss the instructions, and reach a consensus. Rachel's hands shook as she stood and walked back into the courtroom. Evan was brought in from the holding area, his face pale, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape that did not exist. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. He asked the jury foreman if a verdict had been reached. The foreman, he is a middle-aged man in a button-down shirt, stood and said yes. The court clerk took the verdict forms and handed them to the judge. Judge Brennan reviewed them silently, his face giving nothing away, and then handed them back to the clerk to be read aloud. The clerk stood and began. In the matter of the state versus Evan Mercer, on the count of aggravated murder, we the jury find the defendant guilty. Rachel gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. The clerk continued. On the count of murder, we the jury find the defendant guilty. On the count of tampering with evidence, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The words landed like hammer strikes. Guilty, 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 each one final and irreversible. Evan stared straight ahead, his face frozen, his body rigid. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Evan did not respond. He looked like a man who had just realized that the story he had been telling himself, the story where he was smart enough to get away with it, had been a lie all along. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. He remanded Evan to custody without bond, and the deputies moved in to take him away. As the cuffs were placed around his wrists, Evan finally turned and looked at Rachel. She met his gaze without flinching, her face streaked with tears, but her expression resolute. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry? That he had not meant to? That she should forgive him? None of it would have mattered. Rachel had already forgiven more than he deserved over the course of his entire life. There was no forgiveness left. Jean-Evan was led out of the courtroom through a side door, and the sound of the door closing behind him echoed through the silent room. Rachel collapsed into the arms of a family member and sobbed, not out of sadness, but out of relief. The word guilty had been spoken. The system had worked, and Diane Mercer, who could no longer speak for herself, had been heard. 3 weeks passed between the guilty verdict and sentencing, 3 weeks during which Evan Mercer sat in a county jail cell and contemplated a future that no longer belonged to him. The casual arrogance that had carried him through the early stages of the trial had disappeared entirely, replaced by a hollow silence that unnerved even the guards who transported him to and from court. He barely spoke. He barely ate. He existed in the kind of liminal space reserved for people who have finally run out of excuses and must now face the consequences of actions they can no longer deny. Meanwhile, Rachel prepared for the final chapter of the trial, the victim impact statement she would deliver before the judge imposed sentence. She had written and rewritten it a dozen times, struggling to find words that could capture the enormity of what had been taken from her and from the world when Diane died. In the end, she realized that no words would ever be enough. But she would speak them anyway, because her mother no longer could. Sentencing day arrived on a gray morning in early April. The courtroom filled quickly, the same faces that had attended the trial, now returning to witness its conclusion. The gallery held family members, friends who had known Diane, neighbors who had testified, and members of the public who had followed the case and wanted to see justice delivered in full. The atmosphere was different than it had been during trial. The anger was colder now, more settled, shaped into something that felt less like rage and more like gravity. Evan was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face blank. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at Rachel. He stared at the floor as if the ground might open and swallow him, sparing him from what was about to happen. It did not. Judge Brennan entered, and the room stood in unison. The final act was about to begin. The judge began by acknowledging the difficulty of the case and the pain it had caused. He noted that the jury had spoken clearly and that their verdict reflected the overwhelming weight of the evidence. He said that sentencing in murder cases was never easy, but that the law provided a framework and his job was to apply it fairly while also recognizing the specific facts of this case. He then invited the prosecution to present any additional statements or evidence relevant to sentencing. Catherine Morales stood and introduced Rachel Mercer, explaining that Rachel would be delivering a victim impact statement on behalf of her mother and their family. Rachel rose slowly, clutching a folded piece of paper in her hand. She walked to the podium positioned between the prosecution and defense tables, her legs unsteady, but her resolve firm. She unfolded the paper, took a breath, and began to speak. Rachel's voice was quiet at first, but it grew stronger as she continued. She told the court about her mother, not as a victim in a case file, but as a person who had lived a full life before it was stolen from her. She described Diane as a woman who mailed birthday cards to people she barely knew, who kept a drawer full of supplies for children who showed up to school without what they needed, who folded laundry even when breathing hurt because taking care of others was the only way she knew how to be. Rachel said that her mother's illness had made her vulnerable, but it had never made her weak. She had fought every day to stay alive, to stay present, to keep loving people who did not always deserve it. Rachel paused, her voice breaking slightly, and then she said, "The hardest truth. My mother did not die from her disease. She died because the person she loved most in the world decided she was no longer useful to him." Rachel spoke about betrayal as a second crime, one that compounded the horror of the first. She said that murder had ended her mother's life, but the lies, the staging, and the courtroom performance had forced the family to watch Diane's dignity attacked over and over again. She described having to listen to defense arguments that suggested her mother's death was somehow natural or accidental, arguments designed to protect a man who had shown no remorse and no recognition of the suffering he had caused. She said that sitting through the trial had felt like being forced to relive her mother's final moments again and again, and that even now, with the guilty verdict delivered, the pain had not lessened. It had only changed shape. Rachel looked directly at the judge and said, "My mother was scared that night. She knew something was wrong, and the person who made her feel that way was the same person she had been defending her entire life." Rachel turned slightly and looked at Evan for the first time. He did not look back. He kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, his jaw clenched, his hands folded tightly. Rachel's voice turned colder. She said, "You took everything from her. You took her future. You took her dignity. You took her last breath. And even now, you will not look at me because you know what you are. You are a coward who killed a sick woman because you could not stand the idea of taking care of yourself." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then she said, "I hope you spend every day of the rest of your life thinking about what you did. I hope you remember her voice. I hope you remember that she asked you what you were doing, and you answered by ending her life. I hope it haunts you." Rachel folded the paper and returned to her seat. The courtroom was silent. Several people in the gallery were crying. The judge nodded slowly, his expression somber, and thanked Rachel for her courage. Judge Brennan then asked Evan if he wished to make a statement before sentencing. Marcus Gill leaned over and whispered to his client. Evan hesitated, then stood. His voice was flat, almost robotic, as if he were reading from a script he did not believe. He said he was sorry for what had happened. He said he had loved his mother and that things had gotten out of control in ways he had not intended. He said he understood that people were angry, but that he hoped they could see that he had been under a lot of stress and that his judgment had been impaired. He did not say he was innocent. He did not claim the jury had been wrong. But he also did not take full responsibility. He framed the murder as something that had happened to him rather than something he had done. He said he wished things had been different. When he finished, he sat down. The statement had done more harm than good. It confirmed what everyone already knew. Evan Mercer was still more concerned with himself than with the woman he had killed. Judge Brennan leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the bench in front of him. He said he had presided over many murder cases during his time on the bench, but that this one stood out for the sheer callousness it revealed. And he said that Diane Mercer's illness had not been an invitation. It had not been permission. It had not been an excuse. He said that Evan had exploited his mother's weakness, her trust, and her love, and had used those very vulnerabilities as tools of murder. He said that the evidence showed not a moment of passion or a tragic accident, but a calculated act carried out by someone who believed he could hide behind his victim's frailty. Judge Brennan's voice was firm and unyielding as he said, "You did not kill a stranger. You killed the woman who gave you life, who fed you, who housed you, and who defended you even when you did not deserve it. And you did it because she was finally going to hold you accountable." The judge announced the sentence. On the count of aggravated murder, life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the count of murder, life in prison to run concurrently. On the count of tampering with evidence, an additional consecutive term of 3 years. The words were clean and final. Evan would never be free again. He would spend the rest of his life in a cell, with decades to reflect on the night he walked into his mother's room with a pillow and made a choice that could never be undone. Judge Brennan gavelled the sentence into effect, the sharp crack of wood on wood echoing through the courtroom like a punctuation mark at the end of a long and painful story. Evan was taken into custody immediately. The deputies moved in, and he was led out of the courtroom for the last time. He did not look back. There was nothing left to see. After the courtroom cleared, Rachel returned to the house where her mother had lived and died. It was quieter than ever now, emptied of the tension and fear that had filled it in Diane's final months. Rachel walked through the room slowly, touching the things her mother had touched, sitting in the chair where Diane had spent so many evenings. On the kitchen counter she found the appointment card that had started it all, the reminder for the meeting Diane never got to attend. Rachel picked it up and stared at it for a long time. If her mother had made it to that appointment, if she had lived just 2 more days, everything might have been different. But she had not, and no amount of justice could change that. Rachel placed the card in a box of her mother's belongings and carried it out to the car. The house would be sold. The rooms would be emptied. But the memory of what happened there would remain. The case became a reference point in discussions about elder abuse, financial exploitation, and family violence. Advocacy groups cited it as an example of what happens when warning signs are ignored and when vulnerable people are left alone with those who see them as burdens rather than human beings. Diane's story was shared in training sessions for first responders, in legal seminars about recognizing staged crime scenes, and in public awareness campaigns about the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Her death had been a tragedy, but the way it was investigated, prosecuted, and resolved became a model for how justice can still be achieved even when the victim can no longer speak. The video that Evan thought he had erased became the voice Diane no longer had, and it spoke louder and clearer than any testimony ever could. In the end, the story of Evan Mercer and Diane Mercer was a story about choices. Diane had chosen to love her son even when he did not deserve it. She had chosen to give him chance after chance, to believe in redemption that never came. Evan had chosen entitlement over gratitude, control over accountability, and murder over change. Those choices led to a courtroom, a guilty verdict, and a sentence that ensured he would spend the rest of his life paying for what he had done. The smirk he wore on the first day of trial had disappeared. The lies he told to cover his crime had been dismantled piece by piece. The video he thought he had destroyed had played in front of a jury and sealed his fate. The gavel had fallen. Justice, slow and deliberate, had been delivered. And in the silence that followed, Diane Mercer's memory remained, preserved not by the man who killed her, but by the daughter who loved her, and the system that refused to let her death be anything less than what it was. Murder.